In our practice, we represent a number of people that buy or sell a business, and when we do that, generally we set up what is called an asset purchase. So how that works is we have a master purchase agreement, and the master purchase agreement is essentially a document that sets out the guidelines of how the transaction will be handled. We list a number of exhibits that will be used for purchasing the business. So one of the first documents is a bill of sale. A bill of sale is a document that is used to transfer the personal property of the business from the seller to the buyer. So we will list things like goodwill, we will list the inventory, we will list the furniture, the fixtures, the equipment, vehicles, whatever there are. Real estate, of course, would be transferred with a deed. Another document that we have is what is called a Section 1060 Asset Allocation Agreement. That is a very important document. It's a tax document. And what it does is it takes all of those different classes of assets, furniture, equipment, vehicles, goodwill, and the covenant not to compete, and it allocates the purchase price between them. So let's just say the purchase price is $1 million. We may allocate $300,000 to equipment, $200,000 to goodwill, $150,000 to covenant not to compete, etc. Why that's very important is each of those assets have a different lifespan. Now, what I mean by that is you get to depreciate those things or amortize those things for tax purposes. We work with the CPA and we work with, and we are tax attorneys here. So we do that to make sure that we make it work best for the buyer and the seller, depending upon who we are representing. The next document is a covenant not to compete. Now, we've done another video on covenants not to compete for employees, but this is a covenant not to compete for a seller. So when a seller is selling a business, the standard for the covenant not to compete is a little bit different than it is with an employee, because the seller is actually obtaining funds and getting paid for the purpose of not competing. So again, I referred to my other video about covenants not to compete, but in this particular case, the similar standard apply, but there's more leniency given by the courts because a seller is receiving compensation for the sale of his business. The next document, which is an extremely important document, is a consulting agreement. When a seller sells the business to the buyer, there has to be a transition period where the customers or the clients of the company are getting accustomed to the buyer. And depending upon how it's structured, a consulting agreement may be for a week, it may be for 6 months, it may be for a year. Part of the negotiation, and a critical part of the negotiation, is to make sure that the seller and the buyer are on board to make sure that the buyer is successful in the purchase. That's true, especially when there's owner financing. And in very many business transactions where a seller sells the business, they can get more money by financing the purchase themselves. So when there is this owner financing, I actually like to marry the buyer and the seller to say, look, seller, for you to get paid under this promissory note, you need to make sure that you help in the consulting and the transfer of the business from the seller to the buyer. In other words, the buyer's success necessarily depends upon your assisting the transition so that the buyer can pay off the promissory note where they are paying you for the business. The last document is the promissory note. And in the promissory note, one of the things that we do is we actually state in the promissory note generally that if the buyer does not pay under the promissory note, that the seller is released from the covenant not to compete. Conversely, if the seller violates the covenant not to compete, then the buyer is released from the promissory note. Again, I'm marrying the two, and the purpose of that is to say, for the buyer to be successful, the seller has to do what the seller has to do, and for the seller to get paid, the buyer has to perform its duties as well. And therefore, the idea of an asset purchase agreement is to make sure that all of these documents work together so that at the end of the day, the seller gets paid and the buyer is successful in the new business.